Welcome everybody. I'm David Yermak. I'm the host of the webinar today, and I'm going to introduce our speaker, Amy Whitaker, who is my colleague at New York University. Amy is a professor of arts administration and has an extremely interdisciplinary background. She's trained as an artist, but also has an MBA from the Yale School of Management. She has worked at the Guggenheim and at Sotheby's and at Harvard Law School as an internet law researcher and at the hedge fund D.E. Shaw. And some of her fellow travelers, collaborators and mentors have included Will Getzman, Larry Summers, Elroy Dimson. She's probably better networked in finance than anybody else on the call. And she publishes in both art journals and recently in the Journal of Cultural Economics. And today's paper was a recent publication in the finance section of Management Science. So Amy is one of the most interesting and creative people I know and is an authority on blockchains and their applications in the art world. So Amy, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'll just let everyone know that we welcome questions on the fly. If you want to post them in the Q&A, we will stop periodically maybe to take some of them, but we'll probably also leave about 15 minutes of time at the end. So Amy, thank you very much and welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, David, for your generous invitation and introduction. And Fahad, I thank you as well for hosting today. I'm really excited to get to share some work with you all. I'm just pulling up some slides. As David mentioned, I'm planning to talk today about a paper that I published with co-author Roman Kreisel in Management Science. This research is very much ongoing, and so I especially hope to mention some of the things that we're thinking about and still working on in hopes that I may benefit from your feedback and questions. And as David mentioned, he's going to help me watch the chat. So if you have questions as I go, I'm very happy to be interrupted. And I also will pause periodically. I do intend to focus on the empirical work in fractional equity, but I want to make a larger conceptual argument about how we think of art markets as a market for collectibles and how we might, in the context of this fractional equity research, rethink art markets as an environment around artists as operating companies. And I think that this is a quite profound shift that maybe has ramifications in labor markets for creative work, and especially in how we conceptualize property and intellectual property around blockchain. I've been doing blockchain work and work on what property means for artists since around 2012, starting to publish in 2014 and work in blockchain in 2014. And like all of us, these topics were brought especially to the front of my attention in March 2021 with the sale of the $70 million Beeple work, Every Days. Credit where it's due, I give the artist really accolades for how succinctly he summed up everyone's response to the sale. Some people in the arts found this sale a little bit dystopian. And for me, I actually had that experience 5 months earlier when Christie's sold a skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus Rex for $31.8 million in October of 2020. So I want to talk about this a little bit, not just to pander. I know dinosaurs are universally interesting. Excuse me, I think my screen changed. I know dinosaurs are universally interesting from some studies of contingent valuation methods, but I want to talk about it because this sale neatly maps some of the peculiarities of art as a collectible versus what I'm going to call art or artists as a machine. When this was sold, it was expected to bring $6 to $8 million. That estimate was based on the most recent sale of a T-Rex skeleton. You may be wondering how scarce these are. There are approximately 11 of them that have been unearthed since 1970. And this particular one is called Stan because there was an amateur paleontologist who in 1987 found it, but he thought it wasn't actually what it was, so he left it. And these two brothers, Neil and Peter Larson, instead discovered it. The Larson brothers had actually been the discoverers of Sue, the T-Rex that had sold most recently prior to the Field Museum in Chicago in 1997 for around $8 million. And I think they had been somewhat scarred by the experience because they had found it, but they had lost a legal battle with a ranch owner who owned the property that Sue was found on. One of the Larson brothers, I find this kind of extraordinary and a made-for-TV movie detail. He and his former wife wrote a book together on their experience of Sue that is actually titled Rex Appeal. But the brothers fell out, and they may have fallen out in the aftermath of Sue, but the legal settlement was that one of them got the bones, got to sell the sculpture, or rather the skeleton, and the other got all of the intellectual property rights. These are the brothers, Peter and Neil, with a minority owner in their institute and exploratory paleontology company. So you can imagine that when this work sold for $32 million, just for the bones, that was a blow to the brother who had rights to the intellectual property. They had already sold about 60 casts of the dinosaur to universities for around $100,000 each. And I have to imagine that's a somewhat saturated market. I don't know how many more universities than 60 would buy these things, but the skull is trademarked and so forth. So what I want to say about this is that it actually tees up the structural question that I think is most important when we look at fractional equity and the implications for blockchain. And this is a really big question. And it's a question about how art functions as a collectible, or how we reconceptualize art markets around artists. And I don't mean to reduce artists to being a machine. I mean it in the finance operating company sense of having productive resources that generate cash flows that can be put in a valuation model, and also in the sense of taking on risk. And so the story here of the T-Rex bones is quite structurally analogous to the way that a traditional work of art is sold. If I buy a Monet, I buy the painting and the frame. I do not own the copyright. I cannot really do anything with it. But most studies of art markets and art as an asset class are based around this conception of art as a collectible that may have some kind of publicly agreed notion of value and some private value around taste. But basically, the body of literature draws on secondary market auction results. I am an enormous beneficiary of this research. I cite it, I teach it. There are some platforms that sell fractional equity in art that fall under this heading of art as a collectible, notably Maecenas or Masterworks, where they buy a work and they sell usually a minority of the interest in the work in shares to the public. And I think, again, this is the way that art sits in a larger investment context, sort of close to real estate, sort of close to alternatives. So what I'm trying to put forward today in looking at fractional equity, and a question I believe is consequential for how we understand and navigate developing NFT art markets, is how to look at an artist studio or the intellectual property rights as a machine. Conceptualizing the artist as an operating company so that there's creative work with cash flows, and then also modeling art as a process of R&D investment. In my experience working in the arts, artists very commonly judge markets. Some artists have been burned by markets. And as a result, I often find that they are ignoring markets at their peril. They're so busy judging them that they actually get taken advantage of, because it's quite difficult economically and financially to be an artist. And I think that there may be some interesting avenues here toward new models for compensation around creative labor. So the way that I think about this conceptually, and I'm just going to go through a little bit conceptually and a little bit on how fractional equity sits with resale royalties, take some questions, and then get into the empirics of the paper. Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, wrote an essay in 1947 on the origin of the work of art, how to define art, which is obviously a very hard thing to do. And he essentially said that when a work of art is made, a thrust enters history and history is changed. The way that I would describe that is that if you're making a work of art, you're putting something new into the world that changes the world to allow itself to exist. Or as I framed it in a book from 2016. If you're making a work of art in any area of life, you're not going from a known point A to a known point B. You are inventing point B. And this may sound kind of, in the clouds, but it actually presents core challenges to economics and to finance. So you're in the point A world having to acquire resources to make something, and price and value are not moving in lockstep for creative work. You do not know what the value is until you're in the point B world. So you might be thinking of effectuation, Sarasvathi's research, or a number of other kind of Schumpeter style models of creativity in economics, but you're essentially engaged in investment. You're acquiring resources in order to possibly make something of value, to take on risk to make something of value. And what happens a lot in the arts is that artists do not participate in the value that their work creates. So there's a long-standing conversation around this, which comes from the regulatory side or the legislative side around resale royalties. And I just want to say a bit about that for context and how I think about it, not in that way, but in property rights under the Coase theorem. So one of the famous stories in a US context, and I think it's poignant because the US does not have resale royalties, is that the artist Robert Rauschenberg in 1958 sold a work called Thaw via the Leo Castelli Gallery to excuse me, there's an and there, Robert and Ethel Scull, for $900. And in 1973, the Sculls, who were especially inserting an and in their name and going through an acrimonious divorce, sold the work for $85,000 in a landmark auction at Sotheby Park Burnett. Rauschenberg went to the sale and sort of shoved Scull and said, "You better buy more of my work in the future." And this became the impetus for a conversation around resale royalties in the United States, which was put into law in California and then subsequently gutted because it violated the Interstate Commerce Clause. Just so we're all on the same page, theoretically, a resale royalty is an original price, a resale price, and a percentage back to the artist on the increase above the cost basis. If we thought about this kind of philosophically, and we wanted to quantify what would happen for someone like Rauschenberg, if they owned upside in their work, whether through royalties or equity, you could have had Rauschenberg receive 10% of a future sales price. And I think what I want to do is talk. I just skipped ahead to talking about equity, so I just want to go back for a second and finish on resale royalties, and then go back to that. And Christoph, I see you raised a hand. I'm going to come to questions just momentarily. So resale royalties, just by context, are available in approximately 70 jurisdictions. The EU and the United Kingdom both have them, but they're not usually structured the way that I described them, as being taken on a cost above a cost basis. They're often structured as a surcharge, and they're capped. So in the EU, the cap is 12,500 euros. So if you have a multi-million-dollar work, it basically functions as a surcharge. In addition, there's what's called a cascade effect, because many intermediaries in a transaction are all charged the full 12,500 euros, even if the increase in price is more subtle. They tend to be poorly enforced. The California Resale Royalty Act, which went into effect in the late 1970s, up until the 2000s, only $300,000 had ever been collected in total. And what I think is quite interesting about resale royalties is that they function as property rights under the Coase theorem, that once they exist, they can be traded anytime. They don't just have to be collected when the work is resold. But there's a lot of criticism of this. And I'm sure many people in the audience know the criticism. There's a price elasticity of demand criticism that this affects and limits the market for art. There's a welfare being given to artists argument. Guy Rubb and Chris Brigman make this case a lot in the law literature, that artists are being treated as a special category. I would argue that artists are in this very specific R&D position where it just makes sense structurally for them to take a percentage of future upside because it is so difficult to value a work of art at a point in time. So I moved in my own research from looking at resale royalties as property rights to looking at what it would mean for artists to retain fractional equity in their work when it's first sold. And the way I imagined artists doing this is to forego part of the original purchase price so that no one could complain that they were being given welfare. So in this case, a work sells for $900 in 1958, and Rauschenberg buys 10% ownership in it through the opportunity cost of foregoing part of his share of the payment. And then when it's sold, he receives 10% of the auction hammer price. So he becomes explicitly an investor in his own work. So I want to just pause for a moment. Let me open the Q&A and also see if there are questions, David, or if this is Christoph's question. Oh, you actually raised your hand. Well, it's nice to say hello. Christoph and I are part of a team collaborating on an NFT project, so it's nice to see you.
But he withdrew the question, I think.
I know.
Okay.
Are there any other questions that anyone has? I know you promised to take the dinosaur questions, David, so.
My kids are paleontologists.
I kind of feel for Stan, the amateur paleontologist, and honestly for the whole Larson family. So let me just recap a little bit and then continue in presenting the paper. So again, we have this choice between looking at art as a collectible, where there's the artwork and we might divide it into shares, but we rely on what the market will bear, and we tend to have data that is available to use that is secondary market data from auction results, because these are widely available now in databases like ArtNet. And then on the other hand, if we think about it conceptually, artists are the operating companies of the art world. David's colleague, Aswath Namodaran, has used art as an example in his valuation workshops to say, please do not say you're valuing something when you're really pricing it. And people in the arts would say, we do value artworks. We have appraisal systems and auction house specialists who do that. But ultimately, our understanding, our legibility for the value of art as made commensurate with price is these databases of auction results. So I started doing this work on what would happen if artists were centered, if I may say, in markets a bit more. And I started collaborating with Roman Kreuzl to do this empirically. Roman has access to some of the very best auction data in the world. It's about 5 million records that come from the Blouin Art Sales Index. And about 1.9 million of those are painting sales, looking primarily at the time period from 1970 to 2016. And I did a lot of archival research to try to uncover primary market prices. So finding primary market prices is extremely difficult. Sometimes they're not good records, and sometimes no one saved the records because this happened a long time ago before anyone would have been able to know that the artists were important. This is a picture of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg circa 1954. This is a full 4 years before either of them had a show at the Leo Castelli Gallery. So they are paying, in that point A world, they're paying for the cost of their lives day in, day out, before anyone knows the value of their art, just so we're all on the same page and have a kind of working familiarity with, oh, right, that's the artist I was thinking of. Jasper Johns makes work like this. This is Three Flags, which was purchased from the Leo Castelli Gallery early on and sold by the collectors Burton and Emily Hall Tremaine to the Whitney Museum in 1980 for the then astronomical sum of $1 million. It always sounds like Dr. Evil when someone uses that phrase. But you can see here what the records look like if you're trying to find primary market data. I often liken these to recipe cards. Mrs. Tremaine kept index cards as well as binders and insurance records on her collection. And you can see in the upper right corner, sold 1980 Whitney Museum. As if it was very déclassé to talk about money, yet important to collectors to know monetary value. The art information is on the front. And if you flip the cards over, there's often a notation about money on the back. This is an iconic work by Robert Rauschenberg, who is known for many different forms of his practice, but especially combines, where it's sort of a two-dimensional painting and it's sort of a physical object. This one called Bed is actually the one work that sold out of Rauschenberg's first sale at the Castelli gallery. And the only reason it sold is that Castelli bought it himself. Jasper Johns, on the other hand, the Museum of Modern Art and the director of MoMA personally bought works out of his 1958 show, which is highly unusual. So when the Museum of Modern Art in the 1980s decided that Rauschenberg also merited their attention, they were priced out of the market for his work, and Castelli donated this piece. So that's kind of a working understanding of their body of work. And I could find records from collectors. I also was mainly limited to the correspondence files of the gallery. The Leo Castelli Gallery, their papers are in the Archives of American Art. The financial records are embargoed for at least another decade at the request of Barbara Castelli, Leo Castelli's third wife. Leo Castelli's first wife, Ileana Castelli, then Sonnabend, was also an art dealer, and in one of the greatest remarks of all time was asked what she thought of Barbara, and she said, "I have opinions, but no comment." I just want to comment on data availability because it's a really important part of the project. So you're reading correspondence files to extract information. This is actually Leo Castelli's personal notebook from the first Jasper Johns sale and other sales around that time. And it was misfiled, which is why I could find it in the archives. It's not included in the definitive record of Jasper Johns' work, the catalog raisonné, which is also an extraordinary resource in this project. And I know this because I sent it to the catalog raisonné researchers who seemed a little bit cross. They had been looking for it. But just to say, there's a lot of triangulation. And so when Rowan and I started out, I'm going to give you a little bit of the research process view of this as I present. Because we truly didn't know how the artists would do. Like, what would happen if these artists had retained 10% equity when their work was first sold? I don't really know. And we found an entirety of 19 records where we could find the primary market data, and we were sure that we had good auction material. So for example, we did not include the Tremaine sale to the Whitney, even though it was advertised in the press, because we didn't have primary records of that sale. So let me just run through the artwork level analysis, and then I'll expand it out to a kind of fund level analysis as well. So for Johns and Rauschenberg, we took the works they sold through Castelli 1958 to roughly 1962, 63. And for each work, so we have the title here. So I'll take White Flag as an example of one of Jasper Johns' works. It was made in 1955, excuse me, sold in 1958 for $2,000. And then a tidy 30 years later, it was sold at Christie's in 1988 for $6.4 million. So you can see in the following column the nominal gain, and you can see the nominal percentage gain, and then you can see an annualized ROI in the following column. So the right side of this table is where we started to apply the fractional equity logic. So let's say that Johns had foregone 10% of the sales price in order to buy that equity in his own work. So that's effectively an investment of $200. If you had taken $200 in 1958, so at the time of the sale, and you had invested it in the S&P 500, and you would have come to have in 1988 $3,208.95. If we compare that to Johns's investment in his own work, you would have 10% of the $6.4 million hammer price, or $640,000. Just have to move part of my Zoom monitor. So we made just a simple ratio of this. So the ratio of the AHP is auction hammer price to the S&P 500 is 199 times. So he's outperforming the S&P 199 times over. And if we adjust his return, the $640,000, if we take $20,000 off, so we have 512 instead, he's outperforming the S&P 159 times. So this was, if I'm being really honest, this was a little bit embarrassing as an empirical result. We sort of joked it was too big to graph, but but we recognized that it looked like we were cherry picking, but we didn't know when we started out that this would be the case. And we're fully cognizant that this meant we'd established maybe the ceiling and not the floor of what was possible for artists to participate in fractional equity in their work. You can see here how this looks in chart form. The dark line at the bottom is the investment in the S&P. This is a portfolio of all works by each artist. And you can see that the lines track the S&P. And the reason for this is that we had to reinvest the proceeds. So in some studies, similarly, people use the Kaplan-Shore PME, the public market equivalent model. We weren't able to do that because we had such an extended time frame. So we did this kind of de facto rolling PME, where we would, at the point of sale, we would then reinvest those proceeds in the S&P. So this is a limitation of the paper, but the best way that we knew how to deal with this problem of an extremely long time horizon. So we had to expand the paper to have more than our mighty 19 records. And this was hard to do. I was very fortunate to ask a couple of art historians and art advisors, and one of them is a colleague of mine, Melissa Ratchliff-Burt, who said, I've come across a lot of records in the Green Gallery papers, and then Christy Bryce, who said, you need to, excuse me for being blunt here, but you need to find someone who had no children and had no heirs. Betty Parsons would fit that picture. And sure enough, Betty Parsons' records and all of her sales records are in the Archives of American Art. So now we are working with a universe of approximately 1,000 primary market sales, broken down across these two galleries. These galleries represented a range of artists, some of whom are standouts and household names as far as any artist is, and some of whom are quite a bit more obscure. I'm very happy to share these slides. Some of these charts are also in the published paper. So I just want to skip ahead for a second and come back and say that we were trying to figure out if we were looking at a quote unquote representative group of artists. And of course, you know, whether a group of artists is representative is something that can only be known after the fact. At the time, there were really only five to 10 established galleries in New York City, and we were looking at 2 of them. So there was some concern when we started to circulate the paper that we had cherry picked, because Betty Parsons represented early Jackson Pollocks. In 1949 and 1950, you could buy a Jackson Pollock, like a good one, from Betty Parsons for $300. And so there was concern that we were really just looking at that. And what was extraordinary is that when we tried to pull out an annualized ROI, there are a couple of artists who outperformed Pollock. Now, that performance is somewhat idiosyncratic. You'll see that John Graham has only one work that's sold, and that the holding period is quite different. But I have to say, I will forever have gratitude to Richard Tuttle, because he's the first one who showed up in the research who outperformed Pollock. And I can hear Roman go, Richard Tuttle? Who is this, Richard Tuttle? And then, because I work in a studio art department, the next day, a colleague of mine, Jerry Pryor, we were working on a collaborative class we were planning, and he's like, oh yes, I was talking to Dick Tuttle the other day. And I just, I feel enormous gratitude, and also constant reminder of the specificity of all of these people who then become numbers in our papers. Just to kind of give a little more color on the breakdown of the data. These are the kind of distribution of the ROIs. And again, the holding periods vary a lot, so that's a little bit noisy in this picture. But you can see, you know, some kind of patterns you might expect in terms of the distribution and the kind of outlier nature we often see in art markets. And again, the holding periods also really varied. But what's quite interesting is you see long holding periods, and this makes sense because these are works from the 50s and 60s, and the art market really started to take off in the 70s, but at an auction level, much more so even later than that. So as we were going, we started to realize that our hunch that repeat sales might be quite different from what happened if you could find a way to include primary markets. we started to realize that this was probably true, and we needed some way to conceptualize like how art had done over this time period. So we built a hedonic index just kind of for our own sort of check of the data. And we built it from 1970 forward. The reason it doesn't go back to the early sales is that there's not enough auction traction in post-war and contemporary to start to make an index before 1970. You're in the realm of British horse paintings and stuff like that, maybe like a Gainsborough dog or something, but there's not enough critical mass to start to make an index. This is done with typical hedonic tools, and Roman Kreuzl has published a number of papers, including a 2016 paper with Porteweg with some of those methods in it, and the methods are quite clearly delineated in our paper and are all the kind of things that one would intuitively put in a hedonic model, characteristics of the artist and the artwork and the transaction. We isolated the top 100 artists in this category and then compared them to the S&P. So you could say that this chart shows us that the reinvestment in the S&P, the choice to reinvest in the S&P, is somewhat consequential because you can see the S&P outperform the art market after 1992. So we may have kind of intensified some of the art market returns if the sales were well timed. But again, this is sort of context for us in a very new area. So when we took the sales records across the Parsons and the Green galleries, the way that we tried to study them and to study fractional equity within them is to imagine as a proxy that the galleries were a combined fund, as if instead of selling all those artworks, the galleries had bought them all. And in that way, we could look at how 10% of that portfolio would have performed. So here we still see outperformance, but it more closely tracks the S&P, again, because of this kind of reinvestment issue. One of the things I want to highlight that's not statistically significant, because we're only looking at about 20 records. The chart is a little longer than what is in this page, but I tried to make it a readable font size for the purposes of this presentation. We went into the data and tried to look at what the rates of return were across the sample. So the rate of return from primary market sale to first auction, and from primary market to second auction, and from first to second auction. And I realized that the key to the chart is in the cutoff portion, but the dark line, so if you look at the bottom, Desert Rain by Agnes Martin, that's the return from primary market to first auction. So this chart starts to confirm, again, not statistically, but starts to confirm that when we are trying to understand risk and return in an art market, secondary market sales, whether modeled hedonically or by repeat sales, has some skew, which is known and studied. But I think this is remarkable, if more anecdotal, that we might look at a work that has a 7% rate of return in a repeat sale, but a 73% rate of return from when it's first bought to when it's first auctioned. So this points to the importance of trying to get primary market information where we can. And also when we looked at our sample, so including the Johns and Rauschenberg works and the Betty Parsons and Green works, what we found is that 1.7% of them went to auction twice. So that may be anomalous, but even if it's a little bit anomalous, say 10% of works go to auction twice, it's really a small portion of work that's sold. What's interesting is as NFT markets develop, we will see greater data availability. We'll be able to see primary market sales because they're being made in closed environments that are registered on the blockchain. So I think there's a lot of potential movement in this area. But again, as someone who's interested in centering artists and artists as creators of value through labor, I think this is a really important point. So let me stop for a moment before I introduce two other factors that kind of influence my thinking about this data. I'll open the Q&A, and David, if you want to jump in with any questions. It could point to a liquidity premium hypothesis. Yeah, and repeated sales. Do you want to say more about that?
Let me unmute Coz if you just give me 1 second here to go into the participants. Okay, Coz.
Can I? The point I was making. Can you hear me?
Yes,
David?
thank you.
Yes. So once as you find out the returns on the first up to the first sale, from the primary market to the first auction, there is a high return. So let's say the market then perceives that there is a higher liquidity attached to it by the time, let's say, it's sold the second time and then it's sold the third time. So the liquidity in some sense is higher. And it is sort of a well-established result in finance that when the liquidity is low, there is a liquidity premium attached in addition to the risk premium. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that is sort of consistent with that. That is, once the piece is sold 3 or 4 times, people start looking at it as something which is somewhat liquid, and then that premium goes down. So the rate of return then earned would actually go down, as you're finding.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely interesting observation, and I really appreciate the comment. I think in this particular situation, there's an extremely strong information asymmetry, so no one knows anything. They might be able to intuit, but they don't know quantitatively that first return, the 73%. And liquidity premiums are already so unusual in a traditional art market because the sales happen so infrequently in such kind of controlled circumstance. I think that's an extremely interesting hypothesis to test in an NFT marketplace where there's so much more information because of the transparency of the primary market sale and the timestamp on the transactions. I think it would be very interesting to see if that held.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's a really great insight. Are there other questions, or David, do you have any questions?
No, not at this point, Amy. Let's return to the presentation, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what I want to talk about, there are 2 things that again, under this larger umbrella, and I understand this is a kind of pie in the sky question, or kind of challenging a kind of orthodoxy question of what would happen if we went from thinking of art as a collectible to thinking of artists as operating companies. And I'm sure the artists wouldn't enjoy that description, but it's meant to serve them. There are 2 things here, and one has to do with the collaborative nature of art, and the other has to do with the labor lens on art. And I want to go through some of the potential kind of consequences or questions that arise for both. And these are areas of ongoing research. I especially appreciate any perspective. So there's a well-known case. I wrote about this in the Cardozo Arts and Entertainment Law Journal a couple of years ago, but I've continued to really think about it. And many of you may know this case or cases like it. This is Shepard Fairey made a hope poster that helped get President Barack Obama elected in 2008. And he was subsequently sued by the Associated Press because he had used a press photo underneath the picture. Now, Shepard Fairey lied in part of the court proceedings, so that kind of changes the board game structure and points to you're going to get in trouble. But I think this is intellectually interesting because the photo was actually taken by an AP photographer called Manny Garcia, and he was not assigned to take a picture of Barack Obama. He was assigned to take a picture of George Clooney, who was in conversation with then Senator Obama and Brownback talking about humanitarian crises in Darfur in the Sudan. So who has the added value here? Is it Garcia? Is it legally it's the AP, it's a work for hire contract. But then also, if we go back to this idea of making work in the point A world before value is known, Shepard Fairey is volunteering in the point A world before value is known. So I think it's interesting to think about whether blockchain could start to manage rights, not just sale of artwork, so that Shepard Fairey could buy in a clearinghouse, an automated clearinghouse, relatively automated, he could buy rights to use this photo in exchange for a percentage of future upside. So say if he ever used it commercially, he would owe 3% back to the AP. I think this is interesting because what happened in actual fact is that many lawyers were paid fees and a lot of time was taken, and then the parties settled. And the original amount of money that Shepard Fairey had made was $1 million. So I have to imagine a lot of that was eaten up in the legal process. And if this seems like a new issue that artists are working collaboratively, it is obviously not. And one of the really striking images for me in reading this article, which is a kind of definitive resource on the Hope poster case, it's by William or Terry Fisher and a bunch of other people, including Shepard Fairey himself. But they include this photo of the underlying image that Cezanne used for a bather. And I think if we start to consider, again, an added value analysis of art, these questions come up that are quite hard to answer. And I'll just say, when the dinosaur sold in October of 2020, Stan, there were two other records in that sale, one of which was a Paul Cezanne work on paper, which sold for $28 million. So this is not an insignificant kind of financial question either. So what we're starting to see in the NFT space, and there are so many examples of this I could pull in, is we're starting to see the normalization of two things. One is resale royalties, and the other is collaboration or sharing of risk and upside across bodies of people. I think the way the royalties are structured, I hope will still develop substantially kind of from a finance standpoint, but I think these are really interesting structural things to watch. This is a show called Social Codes, curated by an artist and art professor from UCLA named Casey Reese. I'm an advisor to the company that listed these, but that's not why I'm showing it. I'm showing it because it's an easier place to demonstrate these two factors. So in their shows, they have editions of 75. The work sells for $75 in this particular instance. So first of all, you can see that there's an enormous glittery cloud of speculation. These are people who are trying to resell works many times over the $75 in a very short time horizon. But every time a work resells, the artist gets 10%. Now they get 10% of the purchase price. So there's no high watermark, there's no cost basis. So we might want to rethink that over time. And that could become very complex if they're intermediaries to the transaction, like art advisors. But fundamentally, there's shared upside that goes back to the artist. In addition, the artists participate in each other's work. So this particular piece by Dmitry Cherniak was a standout of the show. But the thing is, the first 10 pieces in the edition were circulated so that every artist got a full set. So if I were another artist in the show, I could sell my copy of Cherniak's if I wanted to. You'll notice in the edition column that nothing lower than 21 is for sale here, which indicates that the artist and the other artists are not reselling their copies. But this structure, which is such a kind of foundational intuition of diversification and Markowitz and finance, you're starting to see this happen among artists. And some of this has huge ramifications for DAOs and decentralized autonomous organizational governance, where artists are getting together to create groups like this, where they share surplus across each other. And this really, in some ways, is not new. The idea of artists claiming upside in their work, this dates back to the advent of resale royalties in droit de suite in France in 1920, and the very first art buying syndicate, the Potelors or the Bearskin Club, they gave a percentage of the sale price back to the artists around 1920 or so. But in the US, and in a kind of contracted sense, there is a huge activist movement among artists starting in the late 1960s, when an artist named Takis went to the Museum of Modern Art, took his sculpture out of an exhibition physically, went and stood with it in the garden and waited for the director to come out and tell him it was okay because Takis did not like how his work was installed. This is a work that, by the way, was bought by the Menils and donated to MoMA. So the economics of that and the artist's autonomy are quite unusual. But one of the outgrowths of that activist movement, which is called the Art Workers Coalition, is a contract, the Artist Reserve Right Transfer and Sale Agreement, which was published in 1971. It was written by Seth Siegelub, a kind of dealer, and Robert Prjansky, an attorney. Lauren Van Hoftenschick, who's a co-author of mine on a currently open under resubmission paper, is really the expert in this contract. And if you're curious about this more, I recommend reading her Conceptualizing Artist Rights, kind of definitive overview of it. But one of the things that really comes up here is that the contract was quite speculative in its early stages. It was almost like a conceptual art project unto itself. Artists could receive 15% of the gains. So it does have a cost basis concept. They could receive 15% of the gains when their work was sold. And they also received information about who owned their work, and they could have some rights over how it was exhibited or resold. So kind of controversial. But this is highly conceptual. One of the main artists who used it is Hans Haacke. And if you look at Hans Haacke's total auction market from 1987 to 2020, and I know I'm using nominal dollars here, but the very most he could have been making is about $1,900 a year. So there's really not much traction on resale royalties, privately contracted historically. There is a long history in the US of artists trying to do this, which I think is really to say artists being annoyed at watching their work sell. Many of you may know this iconic work by Grant Wood called American Gothic. It was painted in 1939, and there's a story in the Herald Tribune. And again, my colleague Lauren is really the historian of this. This story in the Herald Tribune that it sold in 1939 for 5 times what the artist was paid. So Grant Wood introduced a contract in 1941 specifying resale royalties. And I always find it a little ominous because, you know, when you put the birth and death dates of an artist in a paper, he died in 1942. So I hope completely unrelated to the stress of watching how his work was selling. But there have been a lot of experimentation from artists toward this over a long period of time. And I think that this is something that we might all pay attention to as the NFT market develops, because there's a lot that's happening in NFTs where on the one hand, there's more complete contracting. The sale is happening in a technological environment. And so there's less hassle to collect the payment for the resale royalty or the fractional equity. And this is enormous. Auction houses that have always hated resale royalties have now kind of accepted them in this technological space. At the same time, my original interest in fractional equity comes from an interest in the difference between property and licenses. This universe we're in where we think we own our music, but actually we own a license to our music. And I know Josh Fairchild has talked about that in this series, and also the company that was my introduction to blockchain called Bitmark. This is why they were founded. The founder realized that he couldn't share his music collection with his then newborn son because he didn't own it, and started looking at property. So if we're looking here at the terms of service for the curated NFT art marketplace called Super Rare, you'll notice that in some ways, they're saying that owning an NFT is different from owning a physical artwork. But in other ways, it's quite the same, that the copyright stays with the artist. But I think that what they're doing here is interesting, and it invites my vigilance or my curiosity as to whether there's stronger terms that could be applied here that are in the language of ownership and not in the language of limited license. So I think it's extremely unclear and still being determined what people own when they buy an NFT. I don't have any issue with, again, the structural division as between the Larson brothers, where one owns the bones and one owns the IP rights to the dinosaur, where you own the artwork and you do not own the ability to commercialize or essentially make the artwork into a machine. It's a collectible for you. I can understand that distinction, but I think the legal language of licensing instead of property is really noteworthy here, and is something perhaps to try to work away from at this foundational stage of the NFT marketplace. So I think what I'll do is just kind of finish talking about artists and some takeaways, and then have time for questions at the end, unless there are any kind of pressing questions at this juncture. So I just want to kind of, again, kind of frame this work in terms of the long-term practice of art and artists. So the thing that interests me most in the Beeple is the labor study here, that this work is based on a drawing a day starting in 2007. Also, parenthetically, I invite everyone to participate in the conceptual art banter around NFTs. I have not yet tired of my brother, who works in finance, his sort of dry-witted conceptual art proposals for how to make the cover of the Wall Street Journal into an NFT. My favorite of which is to shoot a hole in it and name it for Chris Burden, the conceptual artist who had an expert marksman shoot him in the arm in 1971, which is to say there's a very long history of what a graduate student of mine, Camilla Nichols, calls market elusive work, work that's not meant to function in a market. Chris Burden and his estate are represented by the Gagosian Gallery, and Chris Burden also locked himself in a locker once for 3 days, and Larry Gagosian sold the lock. So there are ways people try to make these things market legible. And I think people in the seminar who are able to join in June may have seen my colleague, co-author Christoph's presentation mentioning the certificates of authenticity that are used to containerize conceptual artworks like Solowit wall drawings. And Solowit very famously said, the idea is the machine that makes the art. He subtracted himself out as a laborer a lot of the time to make these conceptual works, and he accepted copies of them or homages to them. But if you do not own the certificate of authenticity, it's like you've lost your private keys and you do not own the work of art. And so again, we have this longer history of the structure of an NFT, which is the certificate of authenticity or a container or a representation like a lock on a locker that functions to make an artwork that is not intended or produced for a marketplace to function in a marketplace. But the other piece of this, and I think it really goes back to the Beeple sale, is the labor aspect. I've shared this example last night in a program at the MCA Denver on non-fungible tokens, but I wanted to bring it in here as well. This is an artist, Tei-Ching Sei, who made a work from 1980 to 1981 where he punched into a time clock every hour, 24 hours a day for a year. There's an incredible video of it that's all the still photos from when he punched in. It's pretty hard to top that as an exercise in labor in art markets. And you also see these long-term conceptual projects. Nina Keshadorian has some of these. Cole Wilson has one I'm quite enamored of called the National Debt Project, where because she was worried about the deficit after 2008, she started taking any spare change she found on the ground and mailing it to the US Treasury Department by registered mail, copied to the White House. And you can see here that she sent them $519.48 at a cost of $18,932.98. But this project is ongoing from 2009 to 2021. Only if it's of interest, Cole also has an NFT project that I think is quite interesting that involves the tattoos on Otzi, the Bronze Age mummy, which she has tattooed onto her body as an art project historically, but also with the permission of the Otzi Museum made into an NFT. That's just to say, when we start to look at NFTs from the artist's point of view, and we start to look at labor and how labor is conceptualized and represented in markets, it's very messy. A coda here is that a colleague of mine at NYU, Kevin McCoy, is the person who made the first NFT. He made it in 2014, so he placed it on the Namecoin blockchain. Ethereum did not yet exist. Kevin made that work as part of a collaboration with the technologist Anil Dash. And they made the work at the invitation of Rhizome, which is a kind of internet archive nonprofit that is connected to the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York. They had 24 hours to make something, and it took Kevin about 15 minutes to make this NFT, and he did it in order to show his partner Anil Dash how it worked. So there are a lot of kind of cliches, if you will, that represent this idea. Picasso once famously said, "This drawing took me 5 minutes in a lifetime." So there's the act of labor execution, and then there's the investment behind it that makes it possible. And I have to imagine that figuring this out economically and finance-wise is a little bit similar to understanding pharmaceutical R&D accounting. And if anyone is expert in that, I would really welcome hearing more about it. So just to conclude, the key takeaways here would be this kind of idea of watching the normalization of royalties and equity in art happening on NFT platforms, and how this is possible because of more complete contracting, which as an aspect of the provenance and public registry on the blockchain. I also think that we should all be watching this early stage structural work that artists are doing to pool risk and share upside. I would argue that although it's human nature for me to watch the kind of glittery cloud cover of speculative auction prices, there's a lot of structural work that may create new economic models for artists that may generalize to economic models for others. And in tandem with that, we may be watching a disruptive technology dismantle some of the taste-making structures of the arts. When that BIPA work sold, 91% of the bidders were new to the auction house. So I think there's a tremendous potential here if we reconceptualize artists as operating companies, to think about a lot of investment structures and to use NFTs to avoid the problem of physical art, to avoid the problem that something like the Artist Pension Trust has, where they took possession of physical works and then had to store them. And I think it's also a way of being honest about the realities of collaborative labor and the economic footprint of that. And it may be the case that NFTs are ascendant because of HODL cryptocurrency early buyers who have no other way to seek diversification. But it's also possible, the thing I think about is, and I'm sorry to say it in a folksy way, but I'll be brief. I remember in grade school learning that Cleopatra had used cat gut as eyeliner and just thinking, but didn't they know, couldn't they tell that that was a strange thing to do at the time? And I wonder, what are the things of our age where we'll feel that way? And I wonder if the fact that salary is structured as a rent of time and labor will ever be even a little bit one of those things. And if we will move toward hybrid forms of pay, the kind that are normalized in some industries, whether that's banking or publishing. But if there are ways that the ease of contracting and the lowering of transaction costs through technology will ever help us do that. So let me stop sharing and come back.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. We have a question from Thomas Rivera. And Thomas, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Hi, Amy. So you brought up a lot of very interesting points about sort of contracting for artists and retaining fractional equity shares. I'm just wondering, is there a specific role that blockchain and decentralization plays here that you're aware of, or is this just kind of, the blockchain has a lot of focus now, and this technology has a lot of focus, and so people are being drawn there, or is there actually some physical feature that makes contracting easier, for example?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, there are a number of reasons I think blockchain is so important here. One is that if you reconceptualize equity or resale royalties as property rights, they need a secondary marketplace in which to trade. And that has to be a low enough transaction cost environment for the Coase theorem logic to hold. And blockchain is exactly structured to do that. The art market has a history of opacity and privacy around contracts issued by the more powerful party. And if there's public registry of the shares, it's possible to enforce payment of royalties and equity because the title transfer is connected to them by a smart contract, and also to kind of create more kind of visibility on that information. And just the sheer automation. Right now, if you want to request copyright for a book, sometimes that's transacted by fax, or by 8 to 10 emails. And so the efficiency gain here is really not to be minimized. Those are the main reasons. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Amy, can I ask about the resale royalty? Two questions. One is, can you opt out and not take it? And the other is it inheritable? So would Grant Wood's heirs have gotten?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So in the European context, droit de suite comes from the framework of moral rights. And so it is inheritable up to a point, and it's considered inalienable from the artist. So I don't think you can opt out of it. There's some systems, and again, these are experimental and under private contract. There's some systems where people are starting to take the resale royalty and donate it to a third party. Cadist is an organization that Lauren works with, where you can take a resale royalty and donate it to a charity, for example. The reason I think fractional equity is so important is that with the utmost respect to the US government and my gratitude for living in a democracy, the proposed legislation is offensively terrible. It's all transaction cost. You're allowed to keep up to 18% for overhead. And the only organizations that are allowed to clear rights are like major copyright bodies that have no incentive to advance beyond their WeFax contract stage. So guaranteed 18%, and that's taken twice. And then the resale royalty, in some of the more recent proposals, they may have started to change it slightly, but half of it goes to the artist and half of it goes to a fund to help museums collect art by only American artists, which I personally find somewhat xenophobic, if well-intentioned. So yes, there's some inheritability. There's no framework in the US with the economic logic of copyright, so I don't think that's been decided. I actually was invited to work on some sample legislation, and I'm planning to at some point. So if anyone has ideas, I really welcome them.
But the point about opting out is, as you and I have discussed before, starving artists aren't terribly interested in the right-hand tail of what, is a speculative return they might get in 20 or 30 years. Most of them need to pay the rent. And it seems to me if there's a 10% retail royalty, it will be a 10% discount on what they take right now from the sale.
Yes.
And most of them would prefer cash up front.
Yeah.
And if it's inalienable, I would rather syndicate it or contribute it to some type of exchange fund with other artists so that we can diversify the risk.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's such a good point. Artists are already so heavily concentrated in their own work. Traditionally artists have held back work in case they got famous later, which is also psychologically burdensome. In that case, I completely agree that it makes sense as a portfolio diversification concern for, there's a woman, Kalani Nicole, who organized an NFT show where each artist who sold a work got 70% and 30% was shared across the group. This is the same logic as the final table in a poker tournament, where if there's $1 million, 3 people are going to walk out with 100,000 and the winner is going to get 700. These are such high risk, intensive, labor intensive efforts that makes complete sense. To my knowledge, it's not alienable. I guess as a conceptual art project, you could be super disorganized on purpose and not claim it somehow or not cash the check somehow. But I've always been skeptical of resale royalties, and I have to say credit where it's due. I got to know some of the staff at DAX, the UK rights collecting agency, and they distribute about 18 million pounds a year. And in contrast, Arts Council England distributes 12 million pounds to individual artists. So it's not to be knocked or dismissed. I think to your point, David, what's really interesting is an enormous development of DAOs among artists where they take the economic surplus and distribute it to new projects that are coming up. So you're really starting to see a lot of that.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 hands raised, and let's hear first from Hannah since she's not yet spoken, and then from Kos a second time.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. It's a wonderful presentation and wonderful topic. So I wanted to ask about the potential of blockchain for decentralization of art market. And we talk a lot about blockchain, potential of blockchain for decentralization. It seems to me of what you are saying is that for NFTs, if NFTs are relating to the actual artwork, but NFTs are not the art, then we need some intermediaries in NFT world that would guarantee the limited number of the NFTs related to a particular work, and wouldn't that create other powerful intermediaries, similarly as we have auction houses and galleries in traditional market? Or is there, maybe referring to your later comment about DAOs that are created by the artists, is there a way to kind of decentralize this market with blockchain technology?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and it's been fascinating to follow your work, Hannah, and your upcoming symposium. I think that, and forgive me, there's construction noise in my building. If I somehow stop being able to think, I apologize in advance. I think that what you're saying is very interesting. The art market, as you describe, is highly centralized, in part because of taste-making hierarchies that have persisted in the arts. So who gets to decide if something is good art, but also because of provenance and authentication and the risk management around transactions. This is a large part of why people pay such high fees to buy at auction. And as David has made this argument, I've made this argument in his class, that provenance is one of the key features of blockchain. It creates such a helpful record. So I think there are ways in which the decentralization of provenance makes it possible to decentralize markets. What you lose is, one, the taste-making function, which may be fine. It may be that we analogously no longer have an elite judiciary for aesthetic taste, and it's all popular votes of who wants to buy NFTs or who has cryptocurrency wealth to pay for them. But what I would like to see in response to what you're raising is attention to standard setting and cooperative behavior across artists. So I think it's really worth figuring out the contracts and trying to normalize a set of contracts, so that rather than having to re-centralize to have an agency that says, oh no, we're going to stop you from making another NFT, you said that was an addition of one, that the smart contract terms or some sort of norming body that itself is decentralized can really take care of that instead. And this is something I think is one of the most hopeful futuristic visions of blockchain, which is that these centralized technology platforms like Google or Facebook get replaced with the kind of whole of the people that they represent. So I'm not the product where Facebook owns my data, but I'm a member of an investment trust where we all own our data together. So the platform becomes pixelated and becomes a body of members. And again, this lowering of transaction costs makes something like that possible. One of the models I've really been looking at a lot recently is called Open Collective. And my understanding is that people put in money, they expect a bond rate of return, and any surplus above that is distributed through a governance model. This occurs well outside the arts, but there are a couple of social practice artists, Caroline Woolard in particular, who are helping them develop the governance systems for how to use that model of distributing surplus for artists and art projects. So I think to your point, if the contractual terms under which the work is sold and the kind of community agreements can exist, I'd like to see a more distributed art market with regard to this gatekeeping function or this kind of limitation of taste making. The canon formation, I think, is especially coming under criticism, where there's especially a kind of desire to engage in decolonial practice or to broaden what we conceptualize as art. And that may not follow from that therefore, whatever an early crypto investor decides is a nice people should become the new gold standard. That may not follow, but I think a little bit more kind of inclusion and broadening is helpful. I think the curation function will persist, and that it may eventually be curation by algorithm or platform. But it's a really interesting question. I hope I'm doing a somewhat justice to it.
It's a fascinating answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah.
Can I ask a
Yes,
question?
please go ahead.
Amy, you've raised some fantastically important issues, not only on the finance and the technical side, but also on the source of value in an artwork, which I think it's fantastically important because, to the untrained eye, many a time, I used to hang out with a bunch of artists in Philadelphia. So sometimes, you see two pieces of art and it's really hard to know what exactly differentiates, an artwork which sells for $40,000 versus $400, So in other words, what exactly is the source of value? And that, of course, is compounded. It was fascinating, the arrangement of risk sharing. Again, among artists, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. However, I also noticed from your evidence that you showed that, maybe some of the risk is idiosyncratic risk, but some of the risk is actually systematic. When the economy is doing well, people are paying higher amounts or they're getting higher prices in the auctions. So, there may be a limit to the amount of risk sharing, which is related to David's point as well,
Yeah.
Exactly, Anyway,
Yeah.
there are fascinating issues, I think.
That's so well said. And I have to say the issue you're raising of, I'll say something about art and quote unquote good art too, but the issue you're raising about market timing. I mean, the work that Johns and Rauschenberg were selling, they really lived through this wave of the development of the art market, a few waves of the development of the market. And I think right now we're in this period of knowingness where people think they understand what the return to art could be. And so sometimes that starts to get very, very quickly priced in to the work because it's such a developed market. And it makes the market somewhat precarious or kind of prone to destabilization. The question you raise about kind of what sells and what's good art, I sometimes describe myself as aesthetically libertarian, where I have a bit of a live and let live. And especially if someone's like rigorous and kind, I'm like, okay, great. And if you've ever been in art school, you're like, oh, wow, you're making a fun fur hut. Interesting. And then the fun fur hut goes away. But one of the artists I want to mention just in relation to what you brought up is Lenka Clayton. The image on the very first slide that looked like a vase, that work is made on a 1957 typewriter. So it's a beautifully, willfully inefficient drawing. And Lenka has a lot of work that's like that. She has a project called Local Newspaper where she took a small circulation paper from Hamburg, Germany, and circled every name in it and met all those people. And that's the artwork. She's based in Pittsburgh, but she had a project in Philadelphia, which you were mentioning a few years ago, where she took a sculpture in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's called Sculpture for the Blind. It's made by Constantine Brancusi, and it's a giant marble egg. And she found a letter from 1978 in the archives of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She was in an artist residency, and it was the letter was addressed to Anne Darnancourt, who was a curator at the museum. And Mrs. Darnancourt never replied to the letter. And in fairness, she was promoted to director, and she actually passed away while she was the director of the museum. So maybe theoretically she could have at some point responded were it not for those circumstances. But this writer, Brian Morgan, said, why is the Brancusi work so important and worth so much? My great-grandfather, who grew up 19 miles from Brancusi, made a marble egg that's very similar but smaller 2 years prior. And so the project is Lenka invites, I think she invited 1,000 people and got 200 replies. I was asked to participate, and they were all letters of response to Brian Morgan about the nature of value. And there's a book of them, and there is an exhibition of them. But I just want to say, if you feel skeptical of contemporary art, you're not necessarily wrong. And I tend to take a bright spots approach to find the work that I personally think is stunning and amazing, and to try to kind of let people do the other stuff, and to talk about it the way that sometimes it's necessary and not impolite to talk about politics, to kind of compare notes and learn together.
I understand. Yeah.
Anyway, it's a great point, and that's probably a longer answer than you needed.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it.
Hey, Amy, let me thank you for a very interesting presentation and It showcases the wonderful interdisciplinary nature of our university as well. We are also the home, of course, of the May Moses Index of auction resales.
That's right.
And,
Yeah.
And it's no accident that the questions from the audience have so many NYU speakers as well. So let me wrap up by simply sharing my screen for a moment and informing everybody about first, the tokenomics conference is 2 weeks from today. It's on a Thursday and Friday. It's actually virtually being hosted by NYU. Hannah is the main organizer, and there'll be no meeting of this group in 2 weeks because the tokenomics conference will occupy that time slot instead. So we urge all of you to register and attend. And then our next forum will be 4 weeks from now on December 2nd. We have the chief scientist of Cardano, very interesting speaker from industry will be joining us at that time. So please register and hope that many of you will attend that talk as well. So Amy, thank you very much for presenting today. And thank you to all the attendees. And we look forward to seeing you guys at Tokenomics in 2 weeks. So good afternoon.